Hi listeners, I'm back again and talking to you about the next part of the series that I spoke to you about relating to grief, where we spoke around Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's stages of grief. I'm going to continue with a few more steps in the grief process, just continuing on from that model. So what we need to be reminded of, which I mentioned in the previous session, was that grief causes depression. And to know what depression looks like. And depression presents itself as people often describe it as a black hole or a black cloud, where your energy becomes totally sapped, your mood becomes totally heavy and negative, your thoughts become negative, suddenly doing things seems like it's even more effort than what it usually requires. Your anger levels and your irritability levels rise, because you become frustrated more quickly. Your tearfulness and your sadness exacerbates. Generally, self-care is one of the first things to go. So suddenly it becomes an effort to hop into the shower, or it becomes an effort to floss or brush your teeth, or an effort to get dressed in the mornings, or to make your bed. And usually those are the signs that things are starting to go. Withdrawal from friends, making excuses not to see them, making reasons why you can't have phone conversations with them. So withdrawal is a very big sign of it, and losing interest in things that you used to enjoy. So suddenly, even if you used to enjoy just going for a walk with a dog and you can't bring yourself to get out the door with the dog, those are very common signs of depression, and a sign that you're not coping. Okay. An important thing to also know is that grief is hazardous to our health. If you think about what you go through with the depression and how you tend to neglect your self-care, you also then start neglecting your health, because you're constantly in a very negative place. And because you're in a negative place, your thoughts are feeling very negative, which means a lot of negative information is getting fed to your brain, which in turn then makes your brain relate to your body in a very negative way. And as we know, the mind and the body are so strongly and powerfully connected. So exercise will be neglected, eating well will be neglected, and usually when people are depressed, they swing to an extreme. So you'll either struggle to eat, and that will have an impact on your body and your health, or you will find that you'll just start comfort eating and eat to the extreme and start reaching for all the carb type of comfort foods, which will also necessarily have an impact in your health. And if you've got a pre-existing health condition, so we think about things like diabetes would be a big one, and any bone disorders or autoimmune disorders, this would create inflammation in your body and would put pressure on those conditions and put more pressure on your health. So that is something important to realize, is that you're really at risk of kind of engaging in physical health difficulties when you go through a grief process, because it takes extra effort to start looking after you when you are mourning somebody. Okay. Also, it's important to realize that you're normal. It feels like you're abnormal. It feels like you've gotten into a fog where you can't function. And I think what a person needs to realize when they're grieving is that it's not normal to feel like you're functioning, right? It's normal that you're actually going into a fog, because your brain in some ways is shutting down, and it's saying right now, we can't cope with this information. We're going to shut down until it feels like it's in a place for you where you can start coping with that emotion. And that's very interesting, and I'm sure you'd have experiences where you will notice that somebody's passed away and you just observe the family members of that person, and somebody is just totally broken down and not functioning, and the other person is going into autopilot, and so very operational and just go. And it just shows you the different ways that people function in grief. And the minute the person who wasn't functioning starts to feel like they can function again, suddenly the person that was over-functioning in operational mode, suddenly the grief process actually really begins. And this might be 6 months later, a year later, and they start crashing, because their brain tells them now, okay, it is safe to grieve now. You don't have to be strong for so-and-so. You can let go now. And then they start switching roles. And it's quite interesting how psychologically this whole process happens without even having this process discussed within each other. It's just the natural symbiosis of the dynamics of grief within families and loved ones. Okay, so it's important to let you know that grievers need to know that they're normal, and that grief, while it feels abnormal, while all the emotions feel abnormal, it's an absolute normal response to an abnormal situation. Okay, it's also important to know that grief makes people feel guilty. And if we think about the natural guilt, just living when somebody isn't living creates a sense of, we call it kind of survivor's guilt. When we think about in war times, when people went to war and they suffered a lot of post-traumatic stress disorder, they had colleagues with them, soldiers they were fighting with. Some of those soldiers came home and some didn't. The ones that came home sat with a lot of what we call survivor's guilt. Why did they get to survive when their colleagues didn't? Why did they get to be with their families and experience things with their families when their colleagues didn't? And usually what that did is it actually robbed them of the opportunity to fully embrace being with their families, because they were saturated with that guilt. And it's the same thing in grieving. It's the guilt of, why do we get to have this life when they don't get to have this life? So guilt is a very common feeling that needs to be worked through during that process. And another one is anger. Okay, guilt, fear, and anger tend to work together very closely. So understanding that becoming angry is a very natural part, because why? If we look at what is anger really, anger is actually sadness, but it's got energy. Because if you think about anything that you are angry about, or anybody that you're angry with, if you really dig a bit deeper, you're actually sad. You're actually sad. And if you didn't have any energy in you, you'd be sad. You wouldn't be angry. But because you still have energy around it, it becomes anger. Okay? All right. So it's important to know that anger around the situation and anger around kind of what has happened is totally normal. Okay? And it also makes us realize that it's part of your everyday makeup right now to know that you can wax and wane between feeling sad, feeling angry, and feeling fearful. Suddenly fear can become a new emotion. Suddenly you start wondering about dying. And lots of people, when they've lost loved ones, suddenly develop a fear of dying, because suddenly they're confronted with mortality and confronted with fatality. So that is also a very natural fear to have. Okay, and then to feel like you lack direction and purpose, because if we can conclude everything I'm saying today, I think we can see it would be very normal to feel like, where am I in life? Where am I going in life? What is happening? Because you will be in a fog. Remember what I said? Your brain shuts down because it can identify that you can't cope. So it almost like puts a veil over you, and it only starts to unveil once it can see that you now have the reserves and the resources and perhaps even the supports to help you to keep going. Okay, so it's important to realize that you're going to feel directionless, you're going to feel purposeless, and you're going to feel like you're questioning the purpose of life and the value of life, and what is the point on earth if we're just going to die? That's usually one of the most common statements that I hear in sessions with people that have lost loved ones. Like, what is this all for, right? And it actually creates a fear of dying. But what that really is about is a fear of really living. Okay, so I just wanted to bring that to you and to normalize that to you for this session, looking at all the different steps and the symptoms. And what I will do in another talk is talk around some tools to support and help during the grieving process. Goodbye.